Welcome, everyone. We'll be starting in a minute or two. Thank you so much for joining us today. Yes, that's great. If you want to put into the chat where you are logging on from, it's always fun to see where everybody is. So I think people are still logging on, but I'm going to get started with the introduction. So again, aloha, everyone. Welcome. My name is Andrea. One second, let me just close my email. Okay, my name is Andrea Nandoskar. I'm the Education Program Manager at Historic Hawaii Foundation. And I want to thank you for joining us today for it's the 37th Annual Experts Historic Preservation Lecture Series. I want to mahalo our event partner, Dr. Ralph Kam. He's the curator of the series, and Dr. Kam is the executive director of Hawaiian Mission House's Historic Site and Archives. This series is sponsored by the Historic Preservation Graduate Certificate Program, University of Hawaii at Mānoa School of Architecture, and Historic Hawaii Foundation. This year's theme is Hawaii's Historic Preservation Pioneers, and today's presenter will speak about William J. Murtagh. Just a note, yes, we are recording all of the sessions. They'll be available immediately afterward on the Historic Hawaii YouTube page, and we're live streaming on Facebook as well. You can see it there. If you have questions as we go through the program, please put them in the chat. I'll collect them and we'll have time for questions at the end and try to get to as many as we can. We also have a brief survey at the end, and it's really helpful to receive your feedback. So please take just 2 minutes to do that for us. We'd be very grateful. If anyone is new to Historic Hawaii Foundation, we are a statewide nonprofit. We are actually in our 50th anniversary year this year, and we help people save historic places, sites that tell the stories of multi-layered history of Hawaii, and we do it through education, advocacy, assistance, and protection of and for historic places. I now want to warmly welcome Dr. Kam, who will introduce today's speaker. Hope you enjoy the program.
I think you're going to be in for a treat today. I have my degree in American Studies, and as I would wander the halls of the American Studies department up in Mānoa, I used to run into Dr. Chapman, and each time I would promise him, I'm going to take one of your classes. And by the end of my doctoral program, I had not taken a single one. So it was indeed fortunate that he had the graduate certificate in historic preservation, because that allowed me to take more than a half dozen courses from him subsequently. And it really piqued my interest in historic preservation. I think that this sort of anecdote are the sorts of key things that happen in the history of people. And that's mine with Dr. Chapman. Dr. Chapman has his own anecdotes that I'll be sharing today. He has a degree in historic preservation, a master's degree from Columbia University, and he has also his DPhil from Oxford University in anthropology. So he's well versed in historic preservation, dozens of publications, and involvement at the international level. So without any further ado, Dr. William Chapman.
Thank you so much, Ralph, for such a good introduction. Ralph did go on to take a few preservation classes, and I can say he's the only student I ever had who volunteered to write a second term paper after the first one was submitted. So I will always remember that. Well, I'm going to start moving. I'll move into my very first slide. And let's see if I can do that. Let's see. There we go. So it's an honor to talk about William Murtagh. Bill Murtagh was I had met him before coming to Hawaii. I think that chance encounter, not entirely chance, we'd been at several professional gatherings, had led me to him, and my name came up as a possible successor for his work here in Hawaii, and I'll bring that more about that later. And so again, I'm very fond of the man. He really kind of paved the way for my own career. And Ralph, I did manage to put the R into the name from the original version that you sent me, and I've augmented the original slide significantly too. It's also a pleasure really to be back with the experts of the Palace. For 25 years, I stood either at the Palace or at High Sam, which now has another name, and also at the Cathedral, and introduced people for this. And I'm glad to see that we're sure that it's the 37th year, because I was never sure if there was one in 86 or not. So I think I'm responsible for that final number that we came up with, but I think that it could be the 38th year. And I also just want to point out that the preservation program has successfully moved into architecture, and it's still a collaboration between this program is still a collaboration between Historic Hawaii Foundation and the program, and now with Ralph at Mission Houses, with Mission Houses as well, so we can always expand our number of cooperators. So this is where Bill was born. Not he was probably born in Philadelphia Hospital, but he grew up in the suburbs of Philadelphia, born in 1923, and it's kind of hard to realize how long ago 1923 was. One would argue that it's possibly a little over 100 years ago now. And what a difference, right? When so much of what even in these pictures are no longer there in Philadelphia, despite its really strong preservation record. And I was kind of reminded that when Bill started at UH, this would have been in 1986. So he was still kind of a young pup from my point of view. And even when I started, he was only 70 years old, but we already considered him quite an elderly scholar and someone well advanced in their career. And now I am advanced over him, and I feel like I'm still a child. So he grew up in the Depression era. And this is any of you familiar with Philadelphia would see Independence Hall there, and all those buildings across the way would be demolished in the 1960s to create the Independence Mall. Later lamented by many preservationists because there were a great number of Victorian buildings, including a number of buildings by Frank Furness, who was one of Philadelphia's own. And that is, in fact, how he pronounced his name, because I was once corrected by one of his family members. But here we are in the 1930s, and this is what downtown Philadelphia would look like then, more recognizable. And Bill considered himself a child of the Depression. He never had a lot of extra money. He had to fight for what he had. And in old age, he became kind of like Cary Grant, with the kind of had a kind of a predilection to be really tight with his money. It was one of his character traits, and he actually took a certain pride in it, but you could always count on him being very cautious on how he spent money. He was educated at Penn, right in his backyard. He got a master's in art, a bachelor's of architecture, and then he got a degree in art history at a time Penn really didn't have a master's in architecture. And then he ended up getting a PhD there as well in the early 60s, when there really weren't very many people in this kind of field. So he during the course of his studies, he became a Fulbright scholar, something he was very proud about. And he went to the University of Bonn and the University of Freiburg in Germany. And he was interested in the impact of sort of German traditions on buildings in Pennsylvania, because as you know, Pennsylvania Dutch architecture is actually Pennsylvania Deutsch architecture. It's always been, people have always gotten that basically wrong. It wasn't Dutch settlers, it was German settlers. And he was very interested as well in the Moravians. And they too had had a presence in Philadelphia, particularly in Bethlehem. So here's young Bill when he's just fresh from his European studies. As a young man, it's the one we have in the poster. And there's some pictures of some of the Moravian buildings that would have been part of his study of Moravian architecture. This one happens to be in Bethlehem, one of the main Moravian centers. So this would be the subject of his PhD dissertation and his first major book, which was Moravian Architecture and Town Planning. And that came out in 1967. And that really kind of set a foundation for his career. He became the director of the Kemmerer Museum of Decorative Arts in Bethlehem. And it was at that time one of the only a handful or double handful or triple handful of museums that actually dealt with decorative arts. The most famous one of that period was the Winterthur collection. And so a lot of preservation was bound up with house museums at the time and with the study of decorative arts. It hadn't yet kind of sprung out into city planning and regulatory laws and things like that at that point. So he had a good grounding in this, and he was there for several years. Then he got in on the ground floor of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. The trust was started through a congressional act in 1949. It was modeled on the British Trust, and the idea was to somehow acquire some influence of and ownership of important estates. Many of you may know in England, they ended up inheriting lots and lots of these big landed estates. The trust in America took a more cautious route and only acquired a few properties of its own. But here you are, here's the group. There's probably, as you see, it's very male dominated. And a couple women there, and one on the staff, it looks like, and then one probably a secretarial staff. And here they are in Philadelphia, at what looks like the Second Bank by William Strickland. So you recognize those Doric columns. So that was, Bill used to joke that the early trust meetings, you could get the whole membership into a hotel room for cocktails after a paper. And so this was a period when the field was very, very small. And Bill's the one standing on the wall, sort of in the back there. So he stayed with the trust for almost 10 years as director of educational programs. Around that time, he also became active in the U.S. Committee of the International Council on Monuments and Sites, or US ICOMOS, or ICOMOS, or ICOMOS. I once had the head of it once gave a talk, and he said it all three ways in a single speech. So I've never figured out exactly is the right way, and nobody knows. And now I think they're trying to change the name of the American version of it to Heritage USA, but right now they're still stuck with ICOMOS or ICOMOS USA. So he was always interested in the international aspects of preservation as well. Now, this is what his real claim to fame was, as the keeper of the National Register of Historic Places. It sounds like it was an existing position that he slid into, but not at all. He actually came up with the term. He kind of borrowed it from the idea of the keeper of the Privy Seal or something in England. He came up with the title, the keeper. Actually, when he retired as keeper, they took it away for a while, and then they became head of section, but they managed to bring it back, and so there's still a keeper of the National Register. So not only did he develop the National Register, but he figured out how the whole system would work. So he came up with the idea of the state offices sharing, getting funding from the federal government. He came up with the idea of review boards in order to make decisions about what a historic property was. He went to, he went to IBM to have them help design a form for him. And he also was involved in the creation of what became known as the 106 process, which was part of the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966 that created the National Register. But this meant that any project that involved federal funding or federal licensing had to be reviewed by the State Historic Preservation Office. And as he always said, he wanted this to be a full partnership. So again, this all came out of not him alone. There were a number of other people at the early periods, Ernest Connolly, let's see, Herbols and a whole bunch of people around at the time. But Bill would be the one that really gave it a consistent approach. So there he is. He told me once he traveled to all 50 states and he'd met every president of the US from Harry Truman on. I'm not sure if he mightn't have met FDR as well. So anyway, this is a later version of the form, but this was basically what he helped create. He used to always say, an average person with average intellect should be able to put the form together. Now, of course, it's evolved since that time and it's now become highly professionalized, and the nuances of what constitutes significance and things like that are much more looked at today than they were back then. And if, in fact, if you look at some of the early forms, they're really quite simple. I remember I did a redo of the Molokai Light, and the original form said 112-foot tower. That was the entire architectural description. And so sometimes it maybe got a little too simple, but at first everybody kind of knew what the nicest house was, the biggest house, the oldest building in your town and stuff. And that was the first range. And then we've gone on to things like complex multiple property nominations of landfill projects in California, things like that that were never envisioned at the beginning of this. But Bill was open to all that. So here's a couple sayings that Ralph provided, and one was that he saw that preservation was really much more than just saving small buildings. He saw it as a way of redefining the way we deal not only with our cities and our towns, but also things such as, air quality and water quality and things of that kind. It was all part of an environmental movement. And he saw that quite early. He also understood this kind of complexity of this conversation between the present and the past, right? He understood the importance of having both together. Now, one of the great things about Bill was his ability to kind of reach across different social groups, age groups, all sorts of involvements, and that would show up because of his basic enthusiasm. He knew everybody that was a preservation advocate or a real player in the community throughout the country, and he did the same in Hawaii as well. But before he came here full time, he took 1 year to be director of the Columbia University program, which is that and the University of Penn, and to a lesser degree, Cornell and Georgia, still the major programs in historic preservation. And in fact, the Columbia University has a School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. It's so important to the school. So he was brought in for 1 year. They had hired a guy named Jacques Dalibard from Canada. He was stood very high in the Canadian structure. And Jacques spent his first year, as he said, observing, and then he had some private problems and then ended up getting stopped at the border, and then he got very upset that he wasn't allowed in to the country without a proper visa, and he left, and Bill jumped into the breach and took over running it for a year. But I had already finished the year before when Bill came. So for his prominent role in preservation, he was given the Louise DuPont Crown and Shield Award in 1980, a very high award with a gigantic big, not only do you get the eagle in the picture here, but you also get a big piece of parchment describing your involvement. And the DuPonts, with Winterthur, of course, being part of what their legacy was, they were among the founders of the National Trust for Historic Preservation back in 1949. So this is a major honor. I've only known 2 people that ever got this award. So then he went to the trust again, and he became vice president of preservation services. So he did another 4 years at the trust. This was their old headquarters on DuPont Circle. They've moved since that time, but this was the center of preservation for many people in DC. Again, that took him to a year at the University of Maryland, which has a program as well. And he was a visiting lecturer at the Florida program at Nantucket. Now, that was again a pioneering program that he had some part in putting together. Blair Reeves was an architect and preservationist who taught at University of Florida in Gainesville, and he had a relationship with friendship with Walter Beinecke, who was the real estate developer who more or less invented Nantucket as we know it today. And so this was a collaboration that students would go. They would learn techniques of measured drawings, and they would be alumni of this program and then go out and bring this knowledge to other people. So this is still ongoing. I just got an ad for it recently, so students can still go to the Nantucket program. Walter Beinecke, who you'll see in a slide in a few minutes, is long gone, but he was again a pioneer in the whole idea of a holistic approach to preservation that would cover an entire island. So he came to Hawaii in 1986, and that's why I think there actually was a Experts at the Palace series that year, which would then make this the 38th year of the program, but not to quibble. But he was invited by Judith Hughes. Judith was then the associate dean of what was Arts and Humanities. She had been the chair of American Studies before that, and she saw preservation as a subject that could really enhance a kind of humanities topic. And what they really wanted was something, quote, practical that students could do after they finished their American Studies program. So Bill came out with her support, was actually signed up for a course that spring. I think he began the experts that spring. And he tried to do this as an interdisciplinary graduate certificate. The University of Hawaii, when they start either undergraduate or graduate programs, often likes to start them out as certificates to see how popular they might be. And he found immediately there was a pent-up market for people who had been practicing in the field but had no real credentials to say that they had been gone through a program of study. So he immediately had great numbers of students, and I think part of it was his charm and energy. Like I said, he was 70 when I really got to know him, and nobody could keep up with him on field school jaunts. He was all over the place, and he knew everybody, and was always so enthused, and he found an aspect of preservation in the most diverse people, like David Collies, who actually didn't believe in regulatory controls, yet he got brought into it. And Leighton Liu in the architecture school was part of the circle. He just found all sorts of people to be bring into the preservation circle, and he would put on parties to get people to come, always paid for by the school, by the Arts and Humanities. It's always amazing how he was able to pull that off. He would always stay with people free of charge. That was another thing. And sometimes it would be a professor away, and he would house sit for the 6 months he came each year. One time he stayed with Mary Cook out at the Cook Mansion out in Mānoa. And Mary used to, anyone who knew Mary could recognize her twinkle when she said something like, "It was so fun having a house guest for so long." But he was shameless in that way, but delightful too. So one of the things that he was kind of got onto was the recording some of Chinatown historic architecture, but this was one in 1987, and it was Bob Graebner who taught at the University of Arizona. And Graebner died at a relatively young age. And so Bob Jarrell was a developer in Chinatown. Phyllis Fox was then head of Historic Hawaii Foundation. And they came together to do the Merchant Street survey. And I know a number of people, every time I would go to a conference, I'd give a talk and people would come up to me and say they'd been on that survey. So this really helped call attention to a lot of the buildings in Chinatown and Merchant Street. So like I said, he started the Experts of the Palace series, and it was always held in the old archives building. And he would bring out people he knew from the field. And in fact, Walter Beinecke came out, Nellie Longsworth, who headed up Preservation Action, an advocacy or lobbying organization in DC. She brought out the Mortons from Icamos, William Seal, who did the White House restorations. It was just, and he would always say the same thing. He'd always say many of the same things, but one of the things he always said was, they can take this up with their tax attorney and they'd come free of charge and they can charge it off to their taxes, but that's not my business. And so that was the way he did this. And I remember one of my colleagues in American Studies was saying, where did he get the funding for that program? And I said, there's no funding for the program. It's sort of just self-driven. Now, mind you, when it started, there were not that many people. And I see now we've got 53 people. We never would have had that many. And in fact, I remember in his early years, because I came out in 92 and gave a talk during the time of my interview. And I'd already been interviewed, but I had delayed taking up the position at UH. I started in 1993. And there would be sometimes just a few people there, maybe 5 or 6. And I would stand on the front steps of this building and just wish people in, and I'd see them wandering across, and I would sometimes yell to them and say, come on in, we have a lecture going. And he had the most interesting crowd. He had one lady that would always watch her watch, and as soon as it hit 12 o'clock, we were supposed to start. And she would always remind us, it's 12 o'clock, time to start. And she was a no-nonsense person. I don't remember her name. And then Bill, at that point, any of you, Aina, will know that you used to be able to get free coffee at Long's. Yeah. And he would actually go there to get free coffee. And then he would meet other people who got free coffee and would invite them to come to the experts. So we had a very colorful crowd, I would say. We had a number of people that probably would be classified as down and out that would be there regularly. And we always had one man in the early years who would raise both hands like this and say, I've been there, I've seen that. And then, so we could always count on that commentary through the expert series. So he did this to bring professionals into the program, to talk to people in the firms downtown, people like Glenn and Spencer who are working downtown, and Ann Yaklovich. They would come regularly to the lectures, and it was a way to keep the whole idea alive. Bill also had the idea of the field school, which was modeled on Nantucket. So the first one was in 1991 at the Bond Estate in North Kahala, and then the second one was at Eva Plantation, and the third would be the first that I was involved in. That would be at Hilo. Some of you may know Barnes Risnick. He worked for over in Maui for the Wilcoxes at Grove Farm and set up that museum. He brought out a guy from the Park Service. He brought out Blaine Cliver from the Park Service. Blair Reeves from Florida came out. He managed to get scholarships through the Western office of the Park Service to bring a number of people from the Pacific Islands out. And so they did an architectural survey of Eva the time that they brought those people out. So again, I remember I was teaching at the University of Georgia when this first began, and I remember looking at the poster and enviously thinking, wow, that would be so much fun to have a field school in Hawaii. Little did I know. So in 1994, the field school was at Kuali'i, the Cook Mansion. It was before the heiau in this picture had been restored. So we did actually provided measured drawings of the whole building. And that's when Jenny Leong, who now works for Manoa Heritage, she was on that field school, and a number of other people that are still active in preservation. And so that was again my second year. Before I met Bill, he had helped put together what became known as the ICOMOS meeting in DC. This was in 1987. I was teaching at the University of Georgia at the time, and it was passed as the Charter for the Conservation of Historic Towns and Urban Areas. Americans call it the Washington Charter because all the other cities where they ever had a meeting got to call it that. There are Mexico charters, Mexico City charters, there's the Venice charters, the earliest of these. But most of the people in other countries don't want to call it the Washington charters. They use the long one. And I gave a paper there about the Caribbean and Virgin Islands. And that was probably one of the first times I met Bill. So while this was going on, he actually wrote a book called Keeping Time. He was very clever in using the word keep and keeper and keeping and bring it together. And so it was first published by something called the Main Street Press. And then I think Main Street Press was a kind of small press, and it published, I remember kind of kidding a friend, Lowell Angel, who worked with him early on, about how the other series were things like Christmas ornaments you can make and things like that. So it didn't really seem to have a great scholarly presence, but the students loved it. And we actually had the manuscript. He dictated this manuscript, and it reads like someone talking, and the students loved the organization of it. There have been several other efforts to write more up-to-date, thorough sort of preservation textbooks, but none really actually meet this. And eventually, in 2006, John Wiley and Sons, which is one of maybe the three biggest academic publishers, took it on and put it back in print. And so you can still buy it on Amazon, and it's still very useful. And if I start, if I don't know if Ralph, if you use this or not in your class, but I think it's still a great model for everything. It touches on planning, it touches on history, it touches on the museum role, and touches on archaeology and cultural resource management. So it's just a very useful book. All right. These are not his houses because I actually don't have a picture of his houses, but he bought one really old 18th century house in Alexandria, Virginia. These pioneering preservationists were also urban pioneers, and they also kind of knew which way the wind was blowing. Charlie Peterson, who actually was out here on Nimitz's staff during the war, started the Historic American Building Survey, actually designed some of the Park Service's early sites like Kitty Hawk, the Wright Brothers Memorial. He bought a double house in Philadelphia, 4-story tall, for I think a song or maybe $1. Houses in this period in the 1960s, when Bill bought a house in Alexandria, going for $1,500, and it was thought to be a very iffy proposition. So he bought a row house, and he also bought a bungalow, and he ended up eventually selling the row house and living in the bungalow. So again, a lot of early preservationists were astute investors, and they saw the value of what they're doing. He also liked the summer in Maine, and he bought this old schoolhouse in Castine. And he was very fond of that. And he had a lot of close ties with friends up in Maine who'd summered there. And eventually they would purchase the house in 1994 from Bill. And then their other headquarters is that Greek Revival sort of, classic 5-bay New England style house to the right. And then the school is now part of their museum and their archives and other collections. So he left that legacy as well. He also started something called the Keepers Fund, and he had a friend that managed this. Eventually, this would be given to the Maine Community Foundation and they still give scholarships in his honor. I've got to say, he tried not to be biased, and we've never really taken much advantage of the Keepers Fund for any of our students. So we've had better luck with the colonial dames and people like that who have been generous locally. But it's probably worth telling a student they should look at the Keepers Fund. Huge impact in Hawaii. He told me he was in Hawaii first in the 1950s. And probably when he was with the National Trust trying to drum up interest, he met Walter Dillingham, who said, "I'm going to build this big shopping mall over there in that swampy area." And he had dinner over at La Pietra when the Dillingham still lived there. He was an enthusiast for Chinatown and all the qualities of Hawaii. And he did that everywhere, actually. I remember meeting him once, and he gave me two pieces of advice. We were in St. Louis, and I said, "What do you think I should get?" And he said, "Well, you're in the middle of the country. You're going to get a steak." And he said, "If you go to the coast, you get some seafood." So I thought, well, that's good advice. And then another time we're going to do a conference, and I said, "When should we do it?" And he said, "Well, if you're going to do it in Hawaii, you do it in the winter. Get more people to want to come." So anyway, he was very practical that way. And that's what he looked like when I really first met him. So he worked with Nancy Bannock, who was the subject of last week's talk, and then Helen Cole, Agnes Conrad, and Francis Jackson, who had written this book, Old Honolulu. And so he was open to this and really promoted their work. He was a particular advisor to Sam and Mary Cook on the preservation of Kuali'i, and he got some startup money from the Cook Foundation. He had two grants of 20,000 each back in the 80s, which would be like two grants of maybe 50,000 each today. So that really helped the program get off the ground. He also, like I said, he spread his net wide, and he was very supportive of the Ko'olave movement. He knew Emmett quite well, and Walter Ritty and the other Ko'olave Nine, and he said, "We need to put the whole of this island on the National Register." And he's the one that really promoted that approach to preservation, and which it did become listed on the register. So he would retire to Sarasota, Florida. I don't have a picture of his particular building. Lowell Angel, who was Bill's assistant here for a while, mine for a little while, he went to visit him there. He lived at Ringling Circle. And at the time, I had an apartment in Marco Polo at 1912, and Bill was at 1912 in his building, which I thought was interesting to know that we shared an apartment number. It was a kind of nice building for well-to-do retirees. He had to bring his piano up with a crane or something, or just a pulley system, because it couldn't come up through the building. It came in out from the outside. And he had a good contact who was an investor who took his money. And I know whenever there was an economic downturn, he said that his investors just being kind to him, because he's at the bottom end of the scale of the people that are being managed, whose wealth was being managed by this person. But he had a very rich retirement. He was honored in many ways. One of them was at by the international version of ICOMOS. ICOMOS made him an honorary fellow, and it is entered into the resolutions of the General Assembly in 2014. So that was one of many honors that he got. And he also got the Ann Webster Smith. Ann was, in fact, worked for ICOMOS in Paris when they were first set up. And I remember when I was beginning my career, I thought, how would I ever get a job as cool as that, And then I also thought, well, there was one person who was very big in the Park Service at the time named Antoinette Lee. And I said, well, I guess you got to be a relative of Robert E. Lee or something. And then I met Antoinette, and she was from Hawaii, and she was not of the Robert E. Lees, but of the Chinese Lees. And she'd made it in the field. So preservation did offer opportunities to everyone. So he died in 2018, which is not very long ago, just before COVID hit. And he had, two long obituaries in both the Post and the New York Times. One called him the Pied Piper of preservation. The other called him the Lion of preservation. Both of those apply. He was a remarkable guy, lovely in every way, funny as all get out, told wonderful stories. And his papers would end up being donated to the University of Maryland, which was nearby. And these are things that you can remember him by. He had a Patek Philippe watch, which he had with a cloth band. It was probably, having looked at them once in a while in news items and things, it was probably worth $50,000. But he wore that with aplomb. He often would wear a necktie. He was very smartly dressed. And something most people didn't know, he could play the piano really well. He could play show tunes and sing songs and things. And he often would do this late at night as the party was sort of had cleared out and there were only a few people around. So again, if any of you had a chance to know him, you were very fortunate. He was a magical man. And one of his sayings, I always remember when he was surprised, he'd always go, "Oh my God." So that was Bill Murtagh, and he was, again, a delight. So thank you for your time. I hope I got in under time, and I haven't checked the chat because I'm afraid it would interrupt my talk. But I guess I'll turn it back to Ralph or Andrea to handle the questions for me, and I can do them. Answer them if I can.
So if anyone has any questions, if you could put them up in the chat, I will read them off to Bill so he doesn't have to glance down at the chat.
I see Edwina's here. Hi, Edwina. Nice to see you again. And I'm impressed at how many people showed up for this. I told Ralph and Andrea that I'm hoping maybe someday we could go back to live meetings, but we could do both, right? Like a hybrid thing, right? We're doing that more at the University of Hawaii. We have the camera set up so you can have some people calling in and some people there in person. That's what I always say to my students. Don't all ask a question at once. Irish heritage. Someone asked, was he of German heritage? But no, Irish. When he was not in Hawaii, he was doing stuff on the mainland. He came every spring. So he followed his own advice. He came after the winter started going. And in the summer, he was in Castine after he finished at UH, and the term would end in May, do the field school. And then he'd spend August in Castine. And then in the fall, he would always attend the National Trust meetings and other meetings. APT usually had its meeting in the fall too. So he would do that. He was active at the Cosmo Club in DC, and he had a lot of friends for the years. Russell Coiney was a good friend of mine, and he would help Bill out, take him to doctor's visits and things as his health began to fail a little bit toward the end. And he had a card, and he called it the Center for Preservation, University of Hawaii. He just kind of made that up. And I would run into him at the trust conferences, and he's handing out the cards. They had him on retainer. At the time, to be honest, I was hoping he would like retire. I was eager to start running the program myself, and he was still there looming in the background. And now I would be able to put up with it, but at the time I was still trying to prove my own mettle. And it was awkward having him out there saying he was head of the program still. But again, always a sweetheart to run into.
So how does one get involved with ICOMOS?
Well, the US has always been criticized by other countries. The Europeans tend to think of it as an exclusive club of experts. And they go on missions, just like they do with UNESCO. So experts do missions. And the American one is very democratic. And so you can simply look up US ICOMOS, ICOMOS, or ICOMOS USA, and you can join as a member. And then if you want to move up in the system, you kind of want to get on one of the committees, one of the international committees. And then if you can be part of those meetings and things, you'll get a chance to maybe move up in the organization. I was on the board for a little while and enjoyed it very much and got to know a lot of different people. And I see Philip's there. Hi, Philip. Philip was a loyal loyal member of the audience for many years at both the palace and at the cathedral. And let's see what Bill did in its other semesters. Hello, University of Maryland. Thank you for bringing your students to the meeting. And we're going to try to share this on our own Facebook page, so you can befriend us on the we have a historic preservation Facebook page that Carolyn is working on to keep up to date, and we're beginning to post things. So again, reach out to us, and you can, I think, and then you guys, Ralph, is this continue to be posted on the Historic Hawaii site as well?
Yes, it will.
Uh-huh. And I think if we can, we'll probably see if we can post it there. We used to record experts at the palace and at the cathedral. And if you look at our Facebook page, you'll see some of the old talks. They're still there that we posted. Ariza Barang was my grad assistant at the time, and that was a kind of a big production. We'd have to come down with a videotape. It wasn't as easy as recording a PowerPoint talk.
I'll give you another chance to discuss organizations that you have been involved with, which is the Fulbrights. And since Bill Murtagh used that in his early career, we have people from historic preservation programs at other universities. You could go into the topic of Fulbrights and Fulbright scholarships.
I see Angie had something in the chat about his birthday party. I remember that. It was at Spencer's house. We had and Agnes was there, and a few, Helen Cole, I think, was still around, and we had a nice surprise party for him. So that would have been probably his 75th, maybe, I'm guessing. She mentioned that he liked Pogs at the time. I remember getting them for friends, kids, picking up the Pog caps. Andrea is asking if anybody else has more memories.
So Bill, do you think you could discuss the Fulbright scholarships and, it had an impact on his early studies?
Right.
How does one get involved in that?
Well, I've had the opportunity, as Ralph probably knows, and maybe Andrea, I've had 4 Fulbrights, which is kind of unusual. I had 2 long Fulbrights, and then I had usually you're allowed two long, or 1 long and 2 short, but I had 2 short ones. And I had the first Fulbright to Cambodia, but I also had an early Fulbright to Italy, where I was able to work with the International Center for Conservation in Rome. So I spent like 7 months in Italy back in the 1980s. And then I had another full year, but not a full year, a full half year one in Thailand, where I taught at Chulalongkorn and at KMIT in Lakrabon. And so those are very nice things. And I still in touch. I get the National Fulbright people still ask me to review proposals for both the short and the long Fulbrights. I serve as an informal advisor to students applying for Fulbrights through the graduate division here at UH, because they have student Fulbrights too. So me and Jay Hartwell and have for many years sat with Julie Maeda and other people at the graduate division, and not really like screening people, but more giving advice on how they could strengthen their application. So, I mean, I was just delighted to get my first one. In fact, Ann Webster Smith was one of my referees for getting my first Fulbright to Italy. And then I ended up becoming just a member of the Fulbright Association in Hawaii in the 90s. And then when Paul Cooper and Ned Schultz were retiring, they asked me to take over the organization, which was still barely limping along. And I became president for like 20 years. So tried to keep getting out of it. You're only supposed to be president of a local chapter for 2. So now Carlos Juarez, who has also been active for many years, has come back to Hawaii, and he's at the East West Center. So we have a number. We're going to go to the Lula Strand House, among other things, with the visiting Fulbrighters. We usually put on a reception for them. They have a couple of events in the spring term. So if you're a student looking for a Fulbright, you just go to CIES, which is the Council for the International Exchange of Scholars, and Fulbright is a State Department program, but they farmed it out many, many years ago to a nonprofit organization that actually does all the heavy lifting for them. And then if you're like a more advanced scholar, they have opportunities for scholars, but they have opportunities for administrators and stuff too. So, like I said, I'm a big supporter of it. I regularly go to the Fulbright office when I go to Thailand. They have a larger office than average, and they have a presence there. And we all talk about good old times. And one of their employees actually got their Master's of Public Administration degree from UH, so she's very fond of Hawaii as well. And every year I look at the architecture candidates from Thailand to judge which ones should get a Fulbright to come to the US. So that's been a kind of constant thing. Let's see. There are examples of buildings and neighborhoods, his efforts. Well, I think he was at the ground floor of creating Malama Manoa, which was Malama o Manoa, until they found out that it was ungrammatical Hawaiian language. And he and I both pushed for the creation of a regulated historic district. And Bill would always say, never have I known an area that was designated as a historic district where the properties went down in value. So he'd always say that. And so we tried to get a special district created in Manoa, and there was a lot of pushback. I think they made it too big. I think they should have concentrated on College Hill and maybe on the Diamond Head side of the valley, where there are Woodlawn area, where there are actually two rather compact districts, but they didn't do that. And so they've created their kind of own hybrid out in Manoa, which they call the thematic historic district, which is basically a district for only people who want to be in it are in it. Now, normally you include the areas that aren't with historic buildings, so you could have some say over what goes on there, but we don't have that. But they do have a lot of listings, and I would say that began with Bill and began with Mary Cook and Helen Nakano, who were promoting the historic districts out in Manoa. Evo certainly was a result of Bill's efforts, but they were supposed to get it nominated just before people bought individual properties, and they didn't. So there's the EVA design review board that I was on at one point, but that was never made a National Register district. So Hawaii's not done very well of creating National Register districts. Chinatown is one. Merchant Street is one. So
Of all of his accomplishments, is there one that you think is the most notable?
well, I would say being the keeper of the register and setting up the whole national program, which I think he's not fully credited with, but it was really so much of that was his own idea, right? And sharing with the states and things like that. So that would be, I think, his main accomplishment in creating a National Register of Historic Places. It's extraordinarily important. Again, I think his great trait was the way something I would never even begin to be able to do as well as he did, was the way of bringing everybody into the tent, people who weren't even really preservationists got into the tent with Bill because he was so charming and he could lasso people into helping him and doing stuff. When Angie was taking the course, he often relied on lectures. In fact, I kind of joked with him at the time, so you just host lectures, right? because I think every topic he would bring in somebody. And he always had the students do something practical. They all had to write one National Register nomination, which is kind of an ambitious thing in the course of a term nowadays.
How do you think Bill Murtagh would have viewed the professionalization of the National Register nomination process?
He actually complained about it. He thought it was getting much too professionalized. He still believed that you should be a person of, I mean, I sit on the Historic Preservation Hawaii Historic Sites Review Board myself right now. We actually had a applicant last time who prepared their own nomination and did an excellent job. And he wasn't a professional, so it can be done, but there's a learning curve involved in it. And I think he probably would have wished that more people could do that. Now, I remember knowing Ernest Connolly, who was he was the person that decided, he was the kind of court of appeals for the investment tax credit projects. And Ernest said a person of higher education, average intelligence should be able to distinguish a new addition to an old building, and if they can't, then it's too imitative. So they all had this idea that there was a class of people who were informed, who understood these things, that could make decisions. But again, I think they maybe didn't need, none of them really took into account that everybody isn't going to be at that level. When I worked in the Virgin Islands, I would many a time visit an empty piece of land where it was explained that there used to be an estate there. They wanted to have it nominated. And I'd have to explain there had to be something there still, even if it's archaeological.
Thank you so much, Bill, and thank you, Ralph. Ralph, I don't see any more questions in the chat. If there's anything else that you want to ask Ralph or Bill that you want to share.
I see we've lost a few people. Our numbers are down.
Well, I think your presentation was really terrific and really covered him as a man and all of his accomplishments. So I think that's why there weren't as many questions.
I want to thank you, Andrea and Ralph, for inviting me. It was a pleasure to have a chance to talk about Bill. And I think it's a great topic this year. I will say, as a speaker, it's not quite as much fun talking to your computer as it is talking to a crowd. You can't gauge, it's sort of like if you're a comic, you want to have an audience, right? You can't gauge if your jokes are going over or there's no responsiveness. So you're just kind of talking into a black hole to some degree. But I understand it also has advantages to reach more people, more convenient for people. Many people aren't mobile and can't get out. Parking, always a problem in Hawaii. And I just saw a note, the neighbor islands were not able to go very well before either. So,
And
thank you for
from the
that.
University of Maryland.
Yes,
Maryland
exactly.
People couldn't take a plane here get here on time, right?
Sure. Well, we will look forward to figuring out how we maybe could go hybrid at some point so we can accommodate both audiences. And I want to thank you so much, Bill, for the wonderful
again,
lecture.
My pleasure entirely. So
Sure. And Ralph, thank you for all of your input and work that you've done on this series. Thanks to everyone for joining us. I hope you will continue to attend the rest of the series we have coming up next Wednesday on February 14th. Patricia Morgan will present on Daughters of Hawaii. And again, for those who are new or aren't signed up for HHF's e-newsletter, please go to our website, historichawaii.org, and sign up so that you can stay up to date on programs like this. And we also share programs from other partners and collaborators and other preservation organizations. And I think that's it. Thank you so much, everyone. It was
Time to
really
renew your
fun.
time to renew your membership in Historic Hawaii Foundation.
Thank
I
you,
just
Bill.
renewed mine. It's the time to do it. So if you're not a member, join.
Thank you for that plug. And thank you to everyone, especially those of you who shared personal anecdotal memories of Bill Murtagh. That was really fun. And until we meet again next week,
So,
ahui ho, everyone.
ahui ho.
Ahui.